All right, so this week we are continuing our series, Emotionally Healthy, Spiritually Strong, and we're talking about embracing grief and loss. And a couple weeks, actually, before I get going, I just want to say for this message, I pulled it really heavily from Peter Scazzero's Emotionally Healthy series. So a lot of what I'm going to say, I didn't just come up with. A lot of it's from him. Some of it's mine, but a lot of it's his. So last time we were talking, we focused a lot on why grieve. Why is it so important to take the time and mourn losses, big and small in our lives, and why is this such an important part of a healthy life? And so this time we're going to talk a little bit more about what grieving our losses looks like. And I think there's a tendency when we talk about this, and I went there the last time that we were talking, but to think directly of big losses, of big griefs, of things like losing a loved one or something that's catastrophic. But what we're going to talk about today involves grieving all of the losses that we experience in our lives, both the large and the small. So there's a woman named Elisabeth Kubler-Ross who has popularized the 5 stages of response to death. And you probably are somewhat familiar with these. They're denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And the idea is that whenever we experience great loss, we go through all of these different stages. And Margaret Skoglund, who was here a couple weeks ago, said we should also add forgiveness and sometimes deliverance to the list. And I think that she was right about that. So for some of us, when we experience loss, our natural tendency is just to stuff it down or try to ignore it. And for others, we might tell ourselves that, it's nothing, right? It's not a big deal. It's just get over it, move on. Who cares, right? And that we shouldn't lament over such trivial things. Some of us might tell ourselves that we don't deserve to be upset or disappointed or hurt all these small or normal losses, but I don't think that any of these responses are good for us. And I think that there's a lie in each one of them. None of these responses help us to move on in an emotionally healthy direction. And all of them are ways for us to stay emotionally weak and to sidestep the process that God has for us to truly grow in our lives, both emotionally and spiritually. So because our focus today isn't just narrowed on grieving death, but just generally grieving loss, I want to have a more broad approach than Elisabeth Elisabeth Kubler-Ross's approach. So Pete Scazzero in his Emotionally Healthy series lays out several different phases of grieving, and that's what we're going to talk about this morning. So the first phase, and we've talked about this actually quite a bit throughout this series, is that we need to pay attention. Right, like we started from the beginning saying the first thing we need to do is recognize that we're being emotional, right? And start peeling back the layers and asking why. Why do I feel like this? Why do I have these emotions? Why do I want to punch this guy's face in, or why do I want to crawl in a hole, or whatever it might be, right? And kind of go deeper and figure that out. And so with grieving, it's also important that we pay attention to our loss. It's important that we pay attention to, I'm hurting, this is affecting me, and not try to sidestep that process and not try to put it to the side or go around it, right? We don't want to minimize it. We don't want to deny it. We don't want to try to escape. We want to pay attention and say, okay, this is happening. In 1 Samuel chapter 1, this says 1 Samuel, it should be 2 Samuel. 2 Samuel chapter 1, 2 Samuel starts with a battle scene. And there's this epic battle going on between the Israelites and the Philistines, and things are not going well for Israel, and they incur heavy losses, and at one point, finally, all seems lost, and the king, Saul, tells his armor bearer to kill him, and he wouldn't. But anyway, the point is that King Saul and his son Jonathan end up dying. And the messenger, there's a messenger who was turned out more than a messenger. He was the one that did Saul in. He comes and tells David about the battle, and David asks about Saul, and he says, "Oh, I did it." And so David actually strikes him down. And then David does something that's interesting. So David, we're not going to go this direction today, but it's so interesting that Saul was trying to kill David for somewhere between like 10 and 13 years. And David yet was still fiercely loyal and supportive of Saul. And so in 2 Samuel 1, starting in verse 17, something very interesting happens. It says, "And David lamented with this lamentation over Saul and Jonathan his son. And he said it should be taught to the people of Israel, or of Judah. Behold, it is written in the book of Jasher. He said, Your glory, O Israel, is slain on your high places. How the mighty have fallen. Tell it not in Gath. Publish it not in the streets of Ashkelon, lest the daughters of the Philistines rejoice, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised exult. You mountains of Gilboa, let there be no dew or rain upon you, nor fields or offerings. For there the shield of the mighty was defiled, the shield of Saul, not anointed with oil. From the blood of the slain, from the fat of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan turned not back, and the sword of Saul returned not empty. Saul and Jonathan, beloved and lovely. In life and in death they were not divided. They were swifter than eagles. They were stronger than lions. You daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you with who clothed you luxuriously in scarlet, who put ornaments of gold on your apparel. How the mighty have fallen. In the midst of the battle, Jonathan lies slain on your high places. I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. Very pleasant have you been to me. Your love to me was extraordinary, surpassing the love of women. How the mighty have fallen, and the weapons of war perished. Wow. It's so interesting to me that even when his sworn enemy died, that David took the time to lament. Right? He paid attention to the grief and the loss, and it wasn't just his own personal loss. Right? But he gave pause and he recognized that this was a loss for the nation of Israel, and that there was now a void, a hole where Saul and Jonathan used to be. He tells the women to mourn for Saul in verse 24. Right? He says, You daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you luxuriously. He instructs the people of Judah to learn this lament for Saul and Jonathan. In verse 18, he says it should be taught to the people of Judah. Not just sung, not just acknowledged, not just listened to, not just something in passing, but it should be learned, it should be memorized, that they should sing David's laments for Saul and Jonathan as their own, that they should adopt these words as they and say, I am sorrowful, I'm grieving over the loss of Saul and Jonathan. And it's interesting because Saul and Jonathan ruled over Israel, and the tribe of Judah was already courting David. At this point, Judah didn't consider Saul their king. And yet David is still saying, let this lament be taught to Judah. he doesn't just pause and say, hey, we should take a moment and remember Saul. But he also gives everybody the words to do it. He really gives a command, right? He tells the daughters to weep. He says, let this lament be taught. Let everybody learn it. We are going to weep. Right? He says, as a country, as a nation, we are going to mourn Saul and Jonathan's passing. And it was so important to David to stop and to pay attention to the hurt and the hole that was left by King Saul, that he even gave Judah the words to grieve with. Even those without their own words were able to grieve, were able to pause. Sometimes people, if somebody dies, you sit around together and just everybody's quiet. Right? You don't know what to say. What can you say? What's going to make a difference? But everybody's hurting. And sometimes it just takes one person to say, I remember when. Remember that one time when we were out in this place and everybody, oh my gosh, that was and they thought this other thing, and then, oh, that's so funny, and then everybody starts talking, and some people might be crying, right, but now this process has started, and David's the first one to speak, right? He starts that process for the nation. He says, learn this lament. Adopt this as your own. Let this start this process of weeping, of mourning for Saul and Jonathan. And I think that this is really intriguing. And like I said, I didn't come up with this on my own. I've seen this before, and I've noticed it. Oh yeah, David mourned Saul, who was trying to kill him, and he was fiercely defensive of Saul because he was the Lord's anointed. And it was interesting because one of the things that was brought out by Pete Scazzero, he says, there's a new government that needs to happen right now. Right? David's longtime enemy. He's not his rival. He's his enemy. He's sworn to kill David. He tried multiple times for over a long period of years. And David's waited longer than Saul's been after him to be king. And now this is his chance. Right now Saul is out of the way. The throne is empty. There's no heir. He's gone. David, this is your moment. Rise and take control. Take power. Let's go. Come on, man. But what does he do? He says, whoa, wait a minute. We can't do that. We need to mourn. We need to weep. We need to grieve this loss. And why? Why stop to mourn? And I can even understand David doing it and those who are with him. Okay, we're going to, take sackcloth and ashes for the next 30 days. We're going to mourn his past. But he doesn't confine it to himself and those who are with him, but he says the entire nation is to mourn. Why? This is what Pete Scazzero says. He says, David understands how indispensable grieving is to spiritual maturity. David knows we are deepened by taking the time to grieve our losses before moving on. He knows how important it is for the people to stay connected to reality and not to run from pain. He knows how important it is for the people to stay connected to reality and not to run from pain. I think that's true, right? How many times when something feels overwhelming, do we seek escape, right? We might sleep a lot. We might watch movies. We might just go out into nature and just get lost for a long time. Whatever it might be, right? Some people turn to less savory things, we'll say, right? To in their attempt to dull the pain. But David says, no, we're facing this head on. We're going to recognize this. We're going to embrace it. We're going to experience this together. And I think it's just as important for us today as it was for King David and Judah in their time. When, as I said, this isn't just confined to big losses, but when we might have a dream or an opportunity that we're excited about. It looks like something's going to happen, right? This is going to come to pass. That things are falling in place, and then suddenly just the bottom falls out, right? It just doesn't work anymore. Right? It's important that we don't just blaze on by. Say, that doesn't affect me, whatever. It's just, I didn't really want it anyway. Like, however we want to minimize it and get past it, it's important that we don't. It's important that we say, no, I've experienced something. This was hurtful, and I'm going to sit here and experience it and work through it. I'm going to stand here, and I'm going to acknowledge it, and I'm going to draw near to God, and on the other end, I'm going to have closure, rather than leaving it as an open wound. And it's very important that we bring these things before God, right? That we bring our disappointment, that we bring our hurt, that we bring our loss before God, that we don't just try to show our strong face to Him, right? We need to remember that God's not just interested in our strength. He's not just wanting us for the times that we're strong, that we're doing something for Him, and look at how amazing we are, and we're accomplishing this and that and the other thing. And He's not just hanging out waiting for the next big thing that we can do for Him. Now, I think that God is honored when we do things for Him, but that's not, He's not hanging His hat on that and just waiting for, what is my superstar going to do today, right? But He's also there when we're weak, right? He's there when we're struggling. He's there when something is happening that we might not want to share to everybody else, but He sees it. He's there when we're broken, when we're hurt or disappointed, when we feel betrayed, or when we experience any kind of loss. He sees it. He knows. He's there. He's present with us. He even knows what it looks like when we ugly cry when nobody's around, right? He's seen that. We have a friend, and she's going through a really difficult time right now, and we've been talking and trying to help. Anyway, we're walking through it with her, and at some point she's crying, and she's like, "Nobody sees me do this, right? You're seeing me ugly crying. I don't show this to anybody, but God has already been there, right? God's already seen it. He's not surprised." And I think the thing that sometimes we forget is that He doesn't just see us in our weakness. He doesn't just see us in our pain. He doesn't just see us when we're grieving a loss, but He wants us to run to Him. He wants us to come and bring it to Him. It's like, any parents, if your kid falls down and they skin their knee, and especially if there's like blood like running down their leg or something, you don't want them to try to hide it and be like, no, I'm okay, right? You want that, I don't know, as a parent, I like it when my kids get hurt and they run to me and are saying, "Oh, Dad, I'm hurt." I want to comfort them, right? I want to put my arms around them. I want to, clean it up and put a Band-Aid on it, make it feel better, right? That's not just a coincidence, right? We inherited that from our Father, that He wants us to draw near to Him in times of difficulty and pain and loss. In fact, when we're weak, He becomes our strength. 2 Corinthians 12:9 says, "But He said to me, 'My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly in my weakness, that the power of Messiah may rest upon me.'" My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. So the first phase is paying attention, right? Making sure that we're not trying to escape and stuff and move on. Pay attention. Embrace it. The second phase is what Scazzero calls waiting in the confusing in-between. And this is that time where maybe the initial shock has hit and it's kind of worn off a little bit, and we're sitting there and we're saying, now what? Now what do I do? Now I've got to get up in the morning. I've got to do this again. I've got to face that person. I have to go back to that place. Whatever it might be. And what am I going to do? We were talking about, maybe we had some opportunity or a dream or something that just got crushed. God, that was my dream. I worked so long. I worked so hard. Now, what am I going to do? Right? We don't just pick up another dream and run with it. Right? There's this space in between that crushing and the healing and the birth of something else. And this is what Scazzero calls the confusing in between. And I think this is also when we look at the Passover, when Yeshua was crucified. Right? This is during this time where the disciples are distraught. And what happened? We thought that he was more like he was coming to rule and reign right now, and now he's lost. Like, what are we going to do? Right? They experienced that in between time, and during this time when we experience this loss, when we experience these hardships, there's two main temptations that face us. The first is answering why. Just why, God? Why? Why is this happening? Why is this happening to me? Why did it happen to them? And the second is trying to fix it. It's okay. Things look, we can salvage it. It's okay. Don't worry, we can just pick up the pieces, we'll just put it back together. Right? Sometimes the pieces don't go back together. So in talking about these two things, it's interesting. I think that Job realized that sometimes there isn't a why. At least not one that we can see. Not one that we can understand or know, at least not right now. Sometimes there is no why as far as we're concerned. And when we recognize that, I think that we also need to recognize that God didn't cause it, but that we can be sure that God will be there for us and will help us to get through it. So there were three things about Job, and without turning and going through this whole long thing, but it's probably more than three things, but three things about Job that when we look at him processing, that we see. First of all, he names his pain. Right? He says he calls all this thing that happens to him evil. He says, he tells his wife, should we accept good from the Lord only? Shouldn't we also accept evil? Right? When something bad happens, he's like, you know what? I'm accepting this. It happened. I can't get away from it. I recognize it for what it is. And he names it and says, this is it. And he doesn't deny it. Right? He doesn't say it's not here and pretend to go on, but he takes the time to lament, to mourn, to grieve. And the second thing is something that he doesn't do, and he never blames God. It's very interesting to me that even right at the beginning, when the wounds are fresh, he doesn't turn around and say, why did you do this? God, I trusted you, and I sacrificed to you, and I made sacrifices for my kids, and look, it didn't amount to anything. What's wrong with you? Why are you doing this to me, right? We don't see him ever doing that. What does he say? He says, naked I came into this world, and naked will I leave. The Lord gives, and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Wow. His wife, she looks at him, she says, are you still hanging on to your integrity? And I used to be really upset with her. Like, how could she be, why isn't she like Job? Come on. Like, he did such an amazing job. What's wrong? And I had to recognize at some point, this woman just lost her entire family. She gave birth to all these kids, and now they're gone. Like, she's struggling. And I think one thing that's different between her and Job is that she's lost in it. She's given up hope of everything. And so she looks at her husband and says, what does it matter? I'm hopeless. This is hopeless. But Job doesn't blame God, and he doesn't try to shift the blame to anybody else either. Right? When his wife comes and says, "Are you still hanging on to your integrity?" He doesn't turn to her and say, "This must be your fault. I did everything right, so must be," like he never says that. He doesn't blame God. He doesn't blame anybody else. He just says this is the way it is. I'm just going to accept it. And the third thing is that Job recognizes that it's not something that he did to cause it to happen. And I think this is important because sometimes when we go through a hardship, when we experience a loss, we say, "Oh, this must be, payback. God's paying me back for when I did this thing, or when I did that, or this is because I screwed up over here." And I think that sometimes there's natural consequences to things that we do, but in this case, Job says, "I'm an innocent man. I just don't understand." Right? He says, "I just don't understand." And through this, he acknowledges, he still says, I'm grieving. And he grieves so much. This is in Job 3. He says, "Let the day perish on which I was born, and the night that said, a man is conceived. Let that day be darkness. May God above not seek it, nor light shine on it. Let gloom and deep darkness claim it. Let clouds dwell upon it. Let the blackness of the day terrify it. Why did I not die at birth?" Right? He's mourning deeply, but he's not blaming God. He's not blaming other people, and he's not saying, I caused this. Right? He's just processing and going through it. He acknowledges that he doesn't understand everything that's happened to him, but he doesn't ask why me or why is it happening. He seems to understand that many times difficult things come through no fault of our own, and sometimes hard times come through no one's fault. They just come. Something else Job doesn't do, he doesn't try to fix his life or make the best of it. He just accepts it. He doesn't deny what's happening. He embraces it. He experiences his grief deeply and experiences his profound loss fully. So Job's not trying to fix it, right? And I think that part of the grieving process and part of accepting that this is going on is that we're not trying to fix it. That we're not now. If there are times where we're trying to make restoration with something is necessary, but I'm talking about something that's outside of our control. We're not going to try to put that together because we're never going to be able to do that. But we need to accept that it happened and move on in the grieving process. One of the things that Scazzero talks about, he says, something he deems climbing the ladder of humility in our grief. And this is something like that Job was very humble in the whole thing, right? It says, in all of this, Job did not sin. In all of this, Job did not sin. In all of this, Job did not sin. God wants us to know it's okay to grieve, and this is a model for doing it. And the first thing that Scazzero talks about for this ladder of humility, he says we need to be patient, right? That we need to experience and not try to rush the grieving process. That we want to let it play out, to fully embrace it, fully experience it, and walk through it, but keep going. The second thing is perspective. When we're going through something, it's often difficult to take a step back and get a perspective on the bigger picture. A lot of times it's only after the fact, sometimes years later, that we can see how certain events shaped us and caused us to grow in certain areas of our lives that we might not otherwise have grown in. And this idea of gaining perspective is particularly interesting, not because we can look back and confirm that all the things do somehow work together for good for those who love God and are called according to his purpose, but because we can, when we gain perspective, which is part of humility, we can look back at how God took something that was ugly, painful, and maybe gut-wrenchingly difficult, and turned it into something good. Not that God caused it, not that God wanted it to happen, not that it was a good thing, but that somehow, somewhere, God brought something beautiful out of the ashes. There's an author named John Milton who compares all these things that happen to a compost pile, and that it's, when you put things in the compost, they might not smell very good, they don't look good, they're not great, but when you mix it with dirt and time and allow processes to happen, eventually is very healthy soil, right? And some compost, when it's done, has a very good and sweet aroma. And it's not that God caused all these things to happen, but that he can bring something good out of it. God somehow transforms evil into good without diminishing the awfulness of the evil. So that's phase 2, to wait in that confusing in between and not try to skirt around it. And then the third phase is allowing the old to birth the new. We need to allow our losses to be launch pads for resurrection. That we need to go through our losses. We need to that they're an important part of life. They're an important part of growth, and that on the other side, that can sprout new life. That can sprout new growth and new depth. And we need to go through things and not around them. Job 42:5. After God has come and has spoken so much to Job, Job says, "My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you." My ears have heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. I think that's the perspective of somebody who's experienced grief and loss and walked through it with God in their midst. There's a quote in the book where he talks about somebody who had gone through catastrophic loss. He lost his entire family in a car accident, and through years of grieving and processing and all this, he comes around and he says, I used to think that God dwells in inapproachable light, right? Nobody can see God and live. He said, I used to think that was because of his glory, he was too wonderful, that we couldn't take it, that we couldn't draw near because it was just too good, and our bodies just wouldn't be able to handle it. But he said, after going through this, I think it's because when I went through this, God was with me, and I think that nobody can see God and live because his grief is so great that we just can't take it, right? Because God walks through grief with us. When we embrace grieving and loss, it creates depth within us. And I've been blessed to experience relationship with both people who have tried to evade their feelings of loss and grief, and sometimes at any cost, and those who fully embrace it. In fact, I've known some people who have lived through many very difficult experiences, whether it's prolonged and profound physical sickness or catastrophic loss or some other kind of loss. And the people who are the most patient, caring, kind, and peaceful are by far those who have chosen to walk through their grief, to embrace it and to experience it fully with God at their side. And I think this is because they've learned that through embracing loss and grief that there's ultimately hope on the other side. Right? Job's wife, I don't think that she had hope. She didn't have anything to hope for at that point. It was lost. But we need to recognize that there's hope on the other side of grief, that there's life on the other side. I don't think that it's any accident that in Matthew 5, Yeshua gives this promise. He says, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." If you've been here for a few years, we went over this a little over 2 years ago, and we looked at this. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. And we looked at what is he really saying here. He says, what we walked away with was how deeply contented, happy, and joyful are those who are brokenly mourning over life's finality, because God's gracious love and comfort is at hand, and they have the promise that death is defeated. It's through pain, grief, and loss that new life can come forth. After all, it was through the death and resurrection of Yeshua that the ultimate life came, right? Now, we now have eternal life through Yeshua because he went through death. And there's a story of a woman that I want to read this morning, and we're almost done. Magda is a Filipino woman in her 60s. She radiates the warmth of Messiah in a way that is nothing less than extraordinary. Her pathway there, however, has been long and arduous. A child during World War II in the Philippines, she witnessed great atrocities that scarred her little soul: starvation, torture, bombings. She vividly remembers as a 6-year-old fleeing from the Japanese across mountains for weeks at a time. Given away to an aunt, she suffered unmentionable losses. Marrying at age 22, she gave birth to 9 children. Desirous to give her children a better life here in the United States, she left them back home while she moved here to be a nurse. Her hope was to bring them over within a year. 10 years later, she was still battling to have her immigration papers approved. She saw her children ages 6 to 14 an average of 1 time every 2 to 3 years. Eventually, they were all able to immigrate. In 1987, while on the Ohio Turnpike with her twin daughters and future son-in-law, the driver momentarily fell asleep and crashed. Her 21-year-old daughter, who was planning to go overseas on a youth ministry mission, died instantly, as did her other daughter's fiancé. Magda herself was in critical condition for weeks. She begged the doctor to let her at least see a video of the wake and funeral of her daughter, but he refused because she was too weak. Then in 2001, another son, aged 36, also died unexpectedly during a physical training exercise in the Army, leaving his wife and 3 children. He had been in the U.S. Navy for 17 years and was planning to become a pastor when his time with the Navy finished. Magda describes how she survived so many catastrophic losses. Quote, "I look at Jesus on the cross, and he suffered more than I have. He withstood such pain and sorrow because he loved humankind. I can too. I want to give something back. God has made me more sensitive to the pain and suffering of people who have experienced death, and I can be his loving hand. I say, Lord, help me to say what you want to say, and let me be your mouthpiece and hands, so people will know you more in their sorrow." Unquote. Today, she leads a bereavement group and serves many others, both inside and outside the church. She enters their pain, leading them in how to grieve properly and connect not only with themselves, but most importantly, to God. 2 Corinthians 1:3-4 says, "Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Yeshua the Messiah, the Father of mercies and God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our affliction, so that we may be able to comfort those who are in any affliction with the comfort with which we ourselves are comforted by God." I'm going to read it one more time. "Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Yeshua the Messiah, the Father of mercies and God of all comfort, who comforts us in our affliction, so that we may be able to comfort those who are in any affliction with the comfort with which we ourselves are comforted by God. Paying attention to our grief, waiting patiently in the in-between and confusing times, and allowing God to make something beautiful out of our loss enables us to have greater compassion on others and reflect the love and compassion of God to them in their time of need. When we process our grief, when we walk through it, when we embrace it, when we experience it in these ways, when we come out the other side, we're not just better for it, but now we can relate to other people. Now we can comfort those who we come across who are also suffering, who are also experiencing loss, who are also grieving, because we've been comforted through the process by God. Let's pray. Lord, we thank you for comforting us in our affliction, in our pain, in our grief, and in all of our losses. Lord, we thank you that you're not just interested in us for what you can get out of us or what we can do for you, but that you constantly watch out for us. God, that you give us a place of solitude and protection to grieve our losses, and that even through all of these, through the process of grieving all these things, that God, you even create beauty out of the ashes in our lives. Father, I pray that you would help us to embrace and process the grief and loss in our lives. Help us to go through it instead of avoiding it. God, I pray that, Lord, that we would know in a personal, experiential way that we can trust in you to comfort us through it all. Lord, I pray that you'd help us to recognize, to know, to learn that when you've brought us out on the other side, that's not just for our own good. Lord, I pray that you would give us grace to help others who are struggling too, who are going through difficult times. God, I pray that you would give us the words, that you would give us the touch, that you would give us the actions that we need to comfort those who are grieving and hurting. Father, we thank you for, Lord, your goodness, that's even in times of loss and grief, that, Lord, that you're still good and you still love us and care for us. In Yeshua's name we pray. Amen. All right. Let's go ahead and stand. All right. And as we dismiss, if anybody